they all converge on one anthropological truth. Despite our physical and cultural differences, we are one human race. But wait just a minute. If that's true, why did the last US Census form that I filled out ask me to identify my race? And they gave you and me multiple choices, right? There's colors like white and black, geographic regions like Asian and Pacific Islander. And heck, if you looked at the ways the US Census Bureau has categorized races over time, there used to be religion races like Hindu, linguistic ones too, like Spanish speaking. They list just about everything under the sun. Well, except for one thing, the human race. So what is it? Are there multiple races, or are our biological anthropology friends correct when they say there's only one race, the human race? Today, as our capstone discussion for part one of our course, we're going to use anthropology to unpack enduring ambiguities between race, skin color, and biology. First, we'll see how anthropology itself has been rather confused about the race concept, and then we'll see how anthropologists eventually came to understand that, biologically speaking, race is nothing but a social construct. I mean, we literally made it up. It has nothing to do with skin color and geography. But the story is a little more complicated than that, so let's get right to it. From the very beginning, anthropologists have been thinking about this thing we call race, and we've struggled with it from day one. Through biological anthropology, we've come a long way from the days when we thought race, biology, and skin color were all one and the same. But that said, this project is far from complete. Anthropologists have been working on the question of race for well over a century, and we've still got a lot to learn. Archaeologist Charles Orser, for example, looked back at how archaeologists have understood race over the decades, and he found that many of them tend to confuse race with ethnicity and socioeconomic status. And his groundbreaking research, no pun intended, helps us separate biological versus cultural constructions of race. And we'll return to that question at the end of our lecture, but first, let's look back to the roots of this issue. Let's see how and why anthropologists, archaeologists included, have had so much trouble coming to terms with this concept of race. Let's start at the beginning, anthropology's earliest version of this thing called race. As we discussed in previous lectures, Darwin's theory of natural selection was a seductive idea, and it formalized a testable and correctable answer to the question of our human origins. And his scientific approach, it can't tell us why there's life on this planet, but it did provide a compelling answer to the question of how, once there was life on this planet, we became human. Actually, his book On the Origin of Species, it didn't exclusively focus on human origins. His theory explained how all species emerged. Anyway, in the early days of anthropology, Darwin's ideas about the biology of evolution proved so convincing that a lot of leading thinkers of the time, they started to apply this idea far beyond the scope of biology. Folks like Herbert Spencer, they argued that just as biological organisms evolved from simple single-cell organisms to more complex ones like you and me, that human cultures, they also evolved from simple societies to highly complex ones. And their assertion was clear. Humans evolve culturally from savage to civilized. And this idea of social evolution, or social Darwinism as Spencer described it, it became a popular explanation for the diversity of humankind across the globe. Think about this. Darwin's book comes out in the mid-1800s, just as the world he's living in grows smaller and smaller. I mean, as the close of the transatlantic slave trade transitioned into the dawn of European empires, people in Darwin's age were exposed to new and diverse world cultures. And inspired by Darwin's ideas on biological evolution, social Darwinists used evolution as a way to explain human diversity and to classify people and cultures across the globe. Humans who lived in small, simple societies, like a single-cell organism, they were deemed less evolved than those who lived in complex ones, with White Houses, Supreme Courts, and microbreweries. But this was the dominant idea of scientists of the era. They literally split the world into culture grades from savage to barbarian and civilized. And when you compare living in a mud hut, right, to life in a two-story suburban home with satellite internet, this idea, it almost feels intuitive. So, as the scientific community ushered in this idea of social Darwinism, the idea spread widely because it helped make sense of the seemingly limitless human diversity on our planet. I mean, suddenly it became easy to explain why some people were entering the so-called modern world with industrial factories, powerful trains, and upper-class values, while others were stuck in the past. Those who were further along on the evolutionary path not only had superior biology, but that advanced biology, those were the foundations for advanced civilization. Essentially, biology and culture were an interconnected and inseparable entity. And the idea of race emerged as an all-encompassing term to describe these vast human differences. So, from our physical appearance, our geography, and our religious traditions, they were all functions of our biology. And to track and make sense of all this human diversity, we use the idea of multiple races. So the differences that Europeans saw in humans from Africa or Asia were attributed to the fact that we all come from distinct lineages, which we called races. Now, upon reflection, many thinkers further developed this idea of human races, and they did so to the extreme that proponents of this way of thinking coined and used the term white man's burden to describe the idea that white men had the moral obligation to use their advanced state to uplift non-whites the world over. I mean, essentially, the concept of the white man's burden was used to justify the colonization of the non-white world. Consider this. It's an excerpt from Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem, White Man's Burden. It clearly embraces the idea of moral uplift through imperialism. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. Take up the white man's burden. And it continues. These so-called half-devil, half-child people of the world, they were seen as slightly less human, and the concept of race helped early anthropologists classify people and their unique biological heritage. Some races were ahead of others, and you know what? Even the US Supreme Court agreed. In 1896, the court heard the case Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the justices considered whether or not the Constitution allowed for discrimination based on white versus non-white races. And what did the justices determine? Well, in a 7-1 ruling, the court held that if nature created people and races that were not equal, the Constitution could do nothing to change that. And as a result, Plessy versus Ferguson cemented race-based segregation as fully legal in a country where all men are created equal. They didn't question the idea that there are multiple unequal and biological races. They accepted inequality as a biological outcome, and no piece of paper, not even the US Constitution, could change that. This idea, it gained favor as a neat and clean explanation for human diversity. And the world order, with whites on top, it seemed to confirm this idea as fact. I mean, the idea was so compelling that the US government and corporate sectors joined forces to make use of this idea in hopes of purifying the human race. I mean, after all, if humans could breed hogs and horses to new levels of fitness and strength, why wouldn't we apply these same methodologies to improve human stocks? Believe it or not, they tried. With millions of dollars of support from the wealthiest families and foundations like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the Harrimans, and more, special research centers were built to find solutions to this white man's burden. And in 1904, for example, the Station for Experimental Evolution, it was established at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island. And researchers at this institute were charged with identifying ways to prevent defective germplasm, the biological and primitive remnants of our savage past, from spreading any further. And it's the eugenics creed that helps clarify this mission, and I'll quote, I believe that I am the trustee of the germplasm that I carry, that this has passed on to me through thousands of generations before me, and that I betray the trust if, that germplasm being good, I so act as to jeopardize it with its excellent possibilities, or from motives of personal convenience to unduly limit offspring. The researchers at the SEE not only developed a series of recommendations on how to proceed with this project, they also started to identify family lines in the New York, New Jersey, and New England area that were tainted by criminality, mental disorders, and physical deformities. And the idea was simple: to find a way to limit the reproduction of what they deemed to be defective human germplasm. Shockingly, their official recommendations included lethal chambers, and that's their words, not mine, as the most effective solution. But they advised policymakers and others that the US population was not really ready to accept this approach. So instead, less revolting strategies were unleashed, namely marriage and sterilization laws. In 1907, for example, the state of Indiana enacted sterilization laws to make sure criminals and other undesirables could not pass on their defective humanity to other generations. And in 1927, the Supreme Court actually upheld a Virginia statute that promoted compulsory sterilization of the so-called unfit. And in the majority opinion for that case, Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes declared, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Actually, early on, this social Darwinist movement was championed by Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who labeled this race improvement project eugenics. And with eugenics research centers at major US universities, all the way from Yale to Stanford, it was actually California that most wholeheartedly embraced the sterilization idea as the best bet for improving the human stock. And believe it or not, in the first 10 years of sterilization laws, California alone sterilized nearly 10,000 people, nearly half of whom were women deemed passionate or bad girls. The idea of applying eugenics to improve humankind spread far beyond US borders and was embraced by many, including, well,